Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Solar Adopter Income and Demographic Trends, an update from Berkeley Lab. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, and we are very excited to have guest speakers with us today from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Before we pass it over to them, I'd like to go over some webinar logistics. If you'd like to minimize the webinar viewing panel, you can do so by clicking on the orange arrow that you see circled here. You can also click on the orange arrow to expand your webinar console. One of the things that you might like to do on your webinar console is to submit your questions and comments. We'll be saving 15 minutes following our presentation for a Q&A with the audience, and we will get to as many questions as we can. To make sure that we get to your question, do type it in when you think of it. Don't wait until the end. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. Slides and a recording of today's webinar will be sent to you via email within 48 hours. And you can also find all of these materials posted on our website at seesaw.org/webinars. This is a good URL to know because it's where we post all of our upcoming and archived webinars. With that, I'd like to pass it over to our host for today's webinar, my colleague, Warren Leon.
Hey, thanks very much, Serene. Before we start the webinar, I want to tell you a little bit about CESA. If you could go to the next slide, Serene. CESA is a membership organization. Our members are public agencies and organizations across the country, and we work together to advance clean energy. And most of our members are state agencies in a large number of states across the country. If you could go to the next slide, you can see logos of our various members. Well, we're delighted today to be focusing on the work that Lawrence Berkeley National Lab has done to analyze trends in solar adoption, especially among low-income customers. And if we could go to the next slide, you can see our speakers today. The folks at Berkeley Lab are not only very skilled at analysis, but they really are excellent at presenting that analysis in clear ways that helps listeners like us understand what they found. And the three people who are going to be speaking, and you can click on handouts to see their bios if you go to your console, but let me just introduce them briefly. Galen Barbose is going to speak first. He's staff scientist in the Energy Market and Policy Department at Berkeley Lab. He will be followed by Sydney Forrester, who's a policy researcher in the Energy Markets and Policy Department at Berkeley Lab. And she's going to be followed by Eric O'Shaughnessy, who's going to give us a demonstration of ways in which you can see the analysis online. And he's an independent renewable energy research consultant and an affiliate of Berkeley Lab. And with that, let me turn it over to Galen, who's going to go first. Thank you.
Great, thanks Warren and Serene. And thanks everybody out there for joining today's webinar. We're very excited to be able to share with all of you some of the highlights from the latest edition of this annual report. I think this is perhaps now the 5th edition in this annual report series. Some of you may be familiar with this document, others may not. This is, as an annual report, really our intent is to provide something of a reference document for policymakers and for the industry. The material that you'll see here is mostly descriptive, and we really use this report and the underlying data just to kind of establish what are the key trends that are happening out there with respect to income and other demographic characteristics for residential solar adopters. We'll talk here a little bit about some of the factors that are driving those trends, but admittedly, we don't really go deep into those sorts of explanations. Really, the intent is just to kind of lay out the facts on the ground as they were. We've done quite a bit of other work that builds upon the data and the trends that we'll share here that does dive deeper into some of the underlying drivers and causes. but you'll just have to be satisfied today with mostly a discussion of the facts. And perhaps in the Q&A, we can go off script a little bit and talk about stuff that we found from some of the follow-on work. Next slide, please. And actually, you can go to the next slide after that. So here, this is just the outline of the full report. The report itself is actually a PowerPoint document, not totally unlike the slides that we'll be sharing here today, but we're not going to be able to cover everything in the report. The gray items shown here, we will unfortunately have to just skip over. Most of the other items we will cover, but not necessarily with the same level of detail as in the full report. So certainly encourage you, if you're hungry for more information or more detail, to look at the full report, which again is a PowerPoint document similar to what we'll be sharing here. Next slide, please. So all of you showed up for the webinar today and read the description of the webinar. So presumably you're at least generally familiar with what this report is about. I won't belabor that here. Mostly, I think I will just point you to the URL on the bottom left of this slide, solardemographics.lbl.gov. That's the location where you can find the report, as well as all sorts of related information, including a data visualization tool, which Eric will be sharing with all of you at the end of the webinar here, and all sorts of other analyses and materials that relate to issues of solar access and equity. So very much encourage you to check out that website, which is really kind of the portal to our body of work in this area. Next slide. So the trends that we'll be showing here are based on a very rich underlying data set. The building blocks are street addresses for about 3.4 million residential PV systems installed throughout the US through the end of 2022. We have details about the PV systems for many of those records, which come from our Tracking the Sun data set. And then we append on to that data set various pieces of socioeconomic data. Chief among those is an estimate or a modeled household income, which is something that we purchase from a company called Experian. Next slide. So the figures here provide a sense for our overall sample coverage. The figure on the left shows our sample size based on the year of installation. And the most important thing to note there is that our sample covers over 80% of the US market. That's the red line at the top of that figure there. And that's been pretty stable over time. And then the map on the right shows our sample coverage state by state. And there you can see certainly some variation in our coverage levels. In most of the major state markets, though, we've got pretty solid coverage, though certainly there are a handful of states where we have lower coverage levels. But this just gives you a sense of the kind of geographical scope and distribution of our sample. Next slide shows how the geographical distribution in our sample has shifted over time. And of course, this largely reflects just geographical shifts in the overall residential PV market in the US. In particular, you can see that California, the darkest shaded portion, represents a fairly large share of the sample, though that share has declined over time. Up toward the top of the chart, you can see that over the past 5 years or so, Florida and Texas have become much more sizable share of the sample, and correspondingly, the Northeast has shrunk in its share. And all of this is important because it helps to explain some of the trends that we'll see later when we're looking at kind of the aggregate socioeconomic profiles of US solar adopters and how those have changed over time. Next slide. So the report goes into lots more detail on the data and methods. I'll just mention one important thing here, which is that the household income values that we'll be referring to throughout the report essentially represent current income levels, not the income level at the time of the adoption. And so when we're looking at time trends in, for example, solar adopter income levels, there's no need to be concerned about how incomes have changed over time because we're essentially already accounting for that. So if you go to the next slide, I'm gonna just quickly walk through some of the kind of high level trends in solar adopter incomes. And so the next slide shows just the overall distribution in household incomes for residential solar adopters in the year 2022. And the main takeaway here is just that solar adopters come from all parts of the income spectrum. You can see about 1/3 of the adopters fall within the range of $50,000 to $100,000 per year. Some might consider that to be kind of middle income. But of course, there's a long upper tail as well, as there is in the income distribution just of households overall. The next slide, we see how compared to the overall US population, solar adopters do tend to be relatively affluent. But the degree of skew or of difference really depends on how we're making that comparison. And so the simplest comparison would be to just compare, say, the median income of all solar adopters, which was $117,000, to the median income of all US households, which was $69,000. So that's a big difference. But of course, residential solar adopters, and we're talking here specifically about rooftop or on-site solar systems, those households are almost entirely owner-occupied households. And so in some sense, it makes maybe more sense in some contexts to compare solar adopters to just the base of all owner-occupied households in the US. And that's the middle bar in the chart here. And there you can see the difference then is smaller, though it still remains. Another factor here is that solar adoption has occurred disproportionately in relatively high income states, such as California. And that partly just has to do with where supported policies have existed and where electricity prices have often tended to be high. And so that, of course, also impacts the comparison that we're making here. And if we control for that and just compare solar adopters to owner-occupied households in the same state, the difference is even less. And the relative benchmark there is that dot above the middle bar at $98,000. So still a difference between solar adopters and the broader population, but much smaller difference than what might first appear to be the case if you're just looking at all US households. The next slide just introduces this metric that we call the solar adopter relative income. And simply, this is just the ratio of the income of a solar adopter to the median income of some comparison population. And that comparison population can be defined at different geographical scales, from the country as a whole down to just the block group surrounding the adopter. And it can also, of course, be defined based on whether you're looking at all households or just owner-occupied households. One important thing that we see here is that the relative income or the skew in solar adopter incomes diminishes as you get to smaller and smaller geographical scales for comparison. And that makes sense because people tend to cluster together in terms of income levels. Even at the kind of the finest granularity, though, when we're just comparing solar adopters to other households in the same block group, still we see that there is some skew where solar adopters at the nationally have incomes that are 125% of the income of all households in the same block group. That's at the national level. The next slide, we see relative incomes at the state level. And we've just sorted these from highest to lowest. And you can see quite a bit of variation here across states, reflecting differences in solar market maturity and different programs and policies. Some of the differences also really simply have to do with broader socioeconomic factors. States that have, in general, high levels of income inequality tend to see higher levels of skew between solar adopters and the population at large. Conversely, states where there isn't a lot of variability in income, you're similarly not going to see big differences between the incomes of solar adopters and other households. You can see when looking at the dots here, where we're comparing just to owner-occupied households in the same state, there are a few states that have essentially reached income parity in the sense that solar adopters look very much like everybody else, or at least all other owner-occupied households in the same state. And so, for example, the font here is very small, but the District of Columbia, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, a number of other states are all sort of hovering around a little bit above or a little bit below that 100% line, which is sort of the demarcation for income parity. Next slide. So I'm going to very quickly go through some time trends. I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but this is a key part of the report. So here we show how the incomes of solar adopters have changed over time. We can focus here just on the line in this chart, which shows the median income of solar adopters based on the year of installation. Again, these incomes are the current income. So we're sort of already, in effect, accounting for inflation. And here you can see that solar adopter incomes have fallen over time, albeit somewhat slowly. That reflects a variety of different factors. PV has gotten cheaper. Financing options have become more widely available. There are, of course, a growing number of programs and initiatives out there aimed at supporting adoption by low and moderate income households, and a variety of other factors. And sometimes when thinking about these trends, we like to distinguish between kind of two underlying dynamics that are at play. There's what we call a broadening of solar markets as kind of solar adoption expands into kind of new parts of the country, as well as a deepening where even within established markets, we see solar increasingly reaching less affluent households within the region. And so the next couple slides will very quickly just give you some intuition around those two components here. So here we see trends in the broadening. And to show this, we've just basically bucketed all of the states into these three different groups: low income states, middle income states, and high income states. And here you can see how the share of adoption among middle and low income states has grown over the past really 8 or so years. The next slide is the deepening slide, and this to illustrate this, we show the change in relative income over time. And there are a couple different versions of this corresponding to different ways of defining relative income. I would say just focus on the two middle lines, which show relative income compared to other owner-occupied households in the same state or in the same county. And there you can see kind of a mixed trend. You can see, pretty clear decline in relative incomes during the first half of the time period shown, which reflects a pretty convincing deepening story. Within the last half, however, it's kind of flat. It kind of bounced up and then has flattened. In the very last year, we do see things dip down again, which perhaps are an indication that this deepening dynamic has begun again. This is an imperfect metric. And I don't want to get too distracted or into the weeds in talking about what we can or can't conclude here. I think the main message, though, is that we do see through this relative income metric some evidence of this deepening dynamic that I mentioned before. I think the last slide before I hand things over to Sydney, here we show the share of the LMI share of US solar adopters over time. Excuse me. So LMI, of course, is low and moderate income. There are different ways of defining LMI based either on area median income levels or a percent of federal poverty level. However you define it, you can see that the LMI share of solar adopters has been growing, but very, very slowly over time. And depending upon which of these metrics you look at, it maybe has even dipped a bit over the past 5 years. So clearly, still a lot of work to do, as we all know, in expanding participation and access to solar among LMI households. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Sydney. You're muted, Sydney.
Hello?
Yep, there you go.
Oh, okay. It was so strange. I wasn't muted, but I guess it didn't recognize my audio. But so Galen sort of went over the first chapter of, I would say, 3 chapters of results. So the first was focused mostly on income trends, and now we break down those income trends by different market segments of rooftop solar. So next slide, please. This is just a list of everything available on our report, and we're not going over the grayed out ones. So here it's just one. So I'll be working through these fairly quickly, and just to reiterate what Galen said, that link at the very beginning of the presentation will take you to the report that has a lot more detail in all of these different categories. So first we will move on to system size. And so essentially, you can see here, basically there is by different color, like a stair step up. So essentially for all of the states, California only, and then all the states apart from California. And regardless of the different categories, you see that as the incomes increase, the system sizes that are installed also increase. And this is because of a few different reasons. First off is just that larger systems cost more. Additionally, higher income households could have a larger roof area, so potentially more place to put the solar, or they could also have a higher electricity demand that they're trying to offset. So all in all, those in the highest income category, so over $200,000 of annual income, have systems that on average are roughly 24% larger than those in the lowest income category, which is at or under $50,000. Next slide, please. So next we'll talk about third-party ownership rates. This is one of those sort of new slides in this version as opposed to older versions. So what we see here is actually a stair step down. So essentially as incomes increase, the portion of solar systems out there that are third-party owned also decrease. So here we can see that for the lowest income group, again, that's less than or equal to $50,000, there is about 1/3 of the systems out there that are third-party owned. So these are like leases or PPAs. And comparing that to 17% in the highest income category, you see that the existence of third-party ownership is roughly double in the lowest income category versus the highest. And we have additional research by Eric, who we'll talk later, and the group that found that third-party ownership has actually driven adoption by lower income households. But TPO has generally decreased in general across the market since the peak in 2015. And now most people opt for solar loans. So next slide will show the storage attachment rate, and we're back again to seeing a stair step up, and the categories are all the same. You can see here that storage attachment rates are a lot higher for higher income households. They remain fairly low across all of the states. So attachment rates for storage were 15% in the highest income group compared to 5% in the lowest income group. So again, that's triple the attachment rate. And then you can see that this is dominated a lot by California, again, because California is has the, I guess, plurality of the rooftop solar market, and their attachment rates are also generally higher. So you can compare all those numbers with the rest of the states. So you can see that that is driving a lot of the sort of higher attachment rates in general. And actually California comprised more than half of all of those paired systems in 2022. So next slide, and again, that was moving really quickly, and I'm also about to move really quickly through this third chapter where we move from income and look instead at other demographic variables. And same goes for all the other stuff. This more details can be found in the report itself, and we'll be happy to answer any questions just because I know I'm going through a lot of material very quickly. So the next slide shows you the different trends that exist in the report, and then the ones that I'll talk about today. Again, not going to spend any time on the home value, occupation, or age, but those are available on the report. And we will be going through the rest of them, and we are categorizing it again compared to sort of the broader population, which in this case is an absolute basis, but also a weighted average, again, across all the states, just because solar adoption doesn't happen uniformly across all of the states. So the next slide is just a summary figure of a bunch of different variables. So this is basically comparing solar adopters to their states, to their respective states. But in general, they're likely to be more rural. They're likely to have higher home values. And this, I should note, is the only variable that's compared to the county instead of the state. So higher home values than their county. And then the rest, again, is compared to their state, more likely to be college educated, non-Hispanic, white, located outside of a disadvantaged community, to be middle-aged, so between the ages of 33 and 55, to hold a business or financial job. And then you see sort of a big jump in magnitude, and you see that they are way more likely to be higher income than their state averages and own a single family home. So this, again, we are going to go into further detail in the next few slides. So the next slide shows the disadvantaged community share of US solar adoption over time. And here you all might be familiar with the federal government's CJust tool. And this is basically, they designated disadvantaged communities based on a bunch of different indicators. And this is at a census tract level. So this designation was created in November 2022. So obviously this is a time trend of way before 2022, and also since this is just through 2022, it's very unlikely that location inside or outside of a disadvantaged community would impact where it was placed, but it's still just good to baseline and to see where the adoption has taken place. And you can see that compared to the share of all US households, the share of solar adopters is below that. So that again is comparing that dotted orange line to all of the bars underneath it. Even so, like with other trends in this analysis, you do see that the share of solar adopters in disadvantaged communities is growing over time. So this has risen from 11% in 2010 to now 22% of solar installed in 2022 was done so in disadvantaged communities. So next slide. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is in the report, and it basically is the same as the slide before, but this time instead of that dotted line, you have that orange dot, and you have those different bars. So you can basically see within each specific state, what is their share of households across the state in disadvantaged communities versus the share of PV adopters in 2022 only. So you can see, obviously, there are a few outliers, but for the most part, again, solar adopters disproportionately fall outside of those DACs, and the places where they are there are more solar adopters in DACs. It's mostly because it is that the solar is located in a specific metro area that has a large share of the population in DACs compared to the rest of the state. So that is places like Pennsylvania, and you can see a few more examples. So next slide, we just want to point out, I'm not going to go over this, but we used an open source package to essentially estimate the race and ethnicity. This is different than previous versions, so we just wanted to highlight that for people who might be used to the different versions that have come out. But the next slide really shows the results of this. So when we look at the sort of the state's population, we wanted to look at whether or not solar adopters were overrepresented in terms of minority adopters or underrepresented. And what you can see is if it falls on the lower right, that means that minorities are underrepresented in the population of solar adopters, and those in the upper left mean that their minorities are overrepresented compared to their state population. So one thing that is interesting is Galen sort of mentioned that comparison groups matter. So when you're looking at just across all households, you see that minorities are actually overrepresented. But when you just, for owner-occupied households, and then for all households, which is the hollow button, wait, I'm trying to sort of think about this in my head because this was incorrect in our first version. I think this is fixed. But essentially, they are underrepresented when you look at all households. But when you look at just owner-occupied households, you see that minorities are actually overrepresented. So this sort of highlights that among owner-occupied households, minorities have a greater propensity to adopt, but that still overall there is underrepresentation, which might have to do with a lot of the entanglements of things like home ownership, etc. So the next slide, I won't spend too much time. Essentially, this is a similar bubble chart in how it's in how you interpret it, but we're looking at rurality, and we find that solar adopters are generally less rural than the U.S. as a whole, but at an individual state level, it can depend. So the next slide is housing type and tenure. And here, again, we're really emphasizing that 94% of systems were installed on single-family owner-occupied homes. And so the rest are split between single-family renter-occupied and multifamily owner-occupied homes. And there's a very, very, very negligible percent of renter-occupied multifamily homes. So we just wanted to re-highlight that. And again, most of these multifamily owner-occupied homes are actually things like condos, so they could even be like standalone structures. So really quickly, you can see here that the income, as you might expect, is larger for single-family owner-occupied householders compared to, again, the other categories. And more information, again, is in the report. So really quickly shifting to conclusions, we talked about this up top, so one more slide. Solar adopters are heterogeneous in terms of their income and demographics. And one more slide, please. And then the solar adopters do diverge from the general population, and they skew towards things like being higher income, non-Hispanic, white, more educated. But of course, it matters how you define that comparison population, whether or not it's by spatial granularity, so at a national level, at a state level, or whether you're accounting for things like home ownership or single family structures. So again, those differences that we see are considerably smaller. And in some case, again, like in the race and ethnicity case, In some cases, the directionality actually reverses when comparing only to owner-occupied households. And so we do see in those time trends pretty much universally that there is a skew, but that skew is decreasing over time. So, you know, solar adopters are generally looking increasingly like just the general population of, again, mostly owner-occupied households in the US, but just the US in general. And then finally, differences between solar adopters and the general population do vary a lot across states, and even more than just states. So Galen mentioned this is just sort of high-level descriptive figures and numbers. However, we do have some different analyses that dive a little bit deeper in. So we just sort of show those trends here. And I think with that, I am passing it over to Eric, because we also have a tool that comes out with aggregated publicly available data that you can download or create maps into figures. So I will go on to mute and
Okay, hello everyone, I'm Eric. We're gonna try to do the screen sharing handoff. Someone has to pass that to me. There we go. Okay, so I'm gonna do a little tour. I always like to start from here. And just how can you find it? Berkeley Lab solar demographics in Google. And as Galen mentioned, we have this landing page. This is a nice resource where all of the publications that we do, including this report, is on here. But we also have a bunch of deep dive studies on different topics related to solar demographics and rooftop solar adoption equity. You can navigate here in a bunch of different ways, but it's this interactive data visualization tool. Close it here since I have it open twice. And this is the solar demographics tool. So a nice thing here is obviously the report provides a lot of nice trends, but we hope to make the data more accessible, more interactive, and that's kind of the idea of the tool here. So the tool has 4 basic panes and then a bunch of filters that let you navigate. So to go through some of the basic functionalities here, we have this map showing different metrics. In this case, it's related to income. So I could say, well, maybe I want it, as we talked about, there's so many different ways to baseline and measure relative income. So you could look just at income, but maybe I want to know % of federal poverty level. I change that and this map changes and it shows me the % of the solar adopter median income as a % of federal poverty level, just for instance. Over here, we have it broken down different ways nationally. There's also a time trend to see things over time. And then down below, we have some different stats, so system size. And if I want to change, I don't think I can because the webinar is kind of window is blocking this, but there's a drop down here. You can look at it in terms of system size or third-party ownership. You can also get more granular, so you can mouse over here and see some useful stats, or you can click on one, say California, and then you see the different plots in terms of California. The map and the data here in the tool go down to the county level, so I can just find any county. Some aren't big enough, but I happen to pick a good one, so you can click on a county and you know, find data for different counties. Again, the plots here will update. Also, in addition to income, we, for the first time this year, this is new, have race here. The only one is you can only do it 2 ways. It's either % minority or % non-Hispanic white. We did have the data available to do different, more broader ethnicity, but we talk about why we only do this kind of binary in the report. But again, the same plots here. And then finally, if you go down below, you can download a bunch of stuff. You can download all of the plots. You can also download the data itself. The data are always aggregated. We can't share system level, household level data, but you can pull the data here at the national level, states and counties. The most granular we can get are the tracks. Someone recently pointed out to me that there's a minor issue with the census tract data, which is on my to-do list to fix. So if you happen to poke around that today, maybe hold off a day or two before you download the track level data, and we'll take care of that. And just in general, if you ever find any issues with the tool, please do let us know. So that's the tool. I think I went through most of the functions here. So we can come back to this if necessary in the Q&A, but for now, I'll return the screen, and I guess we'll pivot to Q&A.
Hey, thanks very much. If our various presenters could turn their cameras on, and I will ask some questions. That was a really good overview. Unsurprisingly, there are a number of questions. And one is, somebody was asking whether you have incremental annual characteristics of solar adopters so that one could see more directly how things have been changing year to year.
Well, I may not have completely understood the question, so if my answer doesn't address it, I apologize. But I mean, that is in effect, I think, what we're showing. So when we show the income trends of solar adopters over time, what we're showing in each year is just the incremental adopters in that year. So 2022 adopters are just the households that installed solar in 2022. So hopefully that both answers your question and resolves the desire underlying your question.
Okay, good. I think the person was maybe also asking, are there ways to more directly compare one year to the next beyond the trend lines you're showing? But I think you gave a clear answer about that. Another person was asking about net energy metering and the concern that net energy metering brings cost shifting from solar adopters to other residents. When you look at these trends, to what extent does deepening adoption of LMI solar interplay with that cost shifting argument, and does it make it more or less compelling and the concern about cost shifting more or less significant?
Well, I mean, certainly the report obviously is not addressing net metering or cost shifting. I think insofar as the concern about cost shifting is specifically a concern about cost shifting on to low income households, what we show is that solar adoption is slowly but consistently penetrating more deeply into less affluent households and communities. That doesn't mean it's necessarily reaching the lowest income tier very well. I think when, we often talk about LMI, which encompasses both low and moderate income, and within sort of the LMI group, most of the solar adopters are definitely more M than L. So I think that's an important distinction to keep in mind. And insofar as there's concerns about cost shifts specifically onto low income customers, I'm afraid our data don't necessarily provide any compelling reason to discard that argument.
Okay, thank you.
I think you do see some adoption trends that at a state level. So again, we don't include any tariff considerations or cost shift in this report. But for example, I think we've observed changes, for example, in Hawaii's market that could be due to changes in the tariff. So for things like a shift to net billing or a tariff that doesn't allow for solar exports, you could see changes in storage adoption, for example. So you can see, I guess, like in some specific states, potential reactions to changes in state regulation.
Okay, thank you. One of the listeners wrote in talking about the fact that in market economics, there's often a discussion of WTP or willingness to pay. In the case of solar, it's really an issue of willingness to adopt. And does your analysis throw any insights into the question of who does have willingness to adopt and who doesn't, and what causes somebody to want to adopt solar or not? And to the extent that your study wasn't all about that, do you know of any good studies that really look at that issue of what makes someone willing to adopt?
Yes, so certainly, you go ahead, Sydney.
No, go for it.
Yeah, so certainly, this report really does not delve into that. We have done some work looking at kind of drivers of adoption and drivers of differences in adoption equity. But we haven't sort of directly explored ourselves kind of the individual customer decision-making process. But there certainly is a lot of, there's a great, body of work out there in that area. The person, I guess, who most immediately comes to mind is Professor Kim Wolski at University of Chicago, who's done, quite a bit of work in this area. Sydney and Eric, you guys may know others as well. So there certainly is, there has been some work sort of, studying specifically kind of the household decision-making process behind solar adoption, but that's not something that we've done.
Also, I guess it's also important to note that this is just solar adopters. It doesn't include any non-adopters, obviously. So there is also a distinction of, there might be a willingness to adopt, but then additional barriers on top of that, which obviously we can't really assume that if you're a non-adopter that you didn't have the willingness. But the research group here with other colleagues also has some sort of survey-based work that is coming out that could touch on this loose, but in the future.
Good, good. Well, and I'd also point out you have 2 studies that you're going to be doing a webinar on for CISA in March, which talks about the impact of solar installations in a neighborhood and on institutions in a neighborhood, being a spur to making it more likely that people will want to adopt solar themselves when they see those things nearby. And so I encourage people to come back to that webinar. I also want to point out an answer to one person's question. Somebody was asking, does this study include low and moderate income community solar programs? And the answer to this is no, this is all rooftop solar. Somebody was asking, they were struck by the slide early on, which compared incomes of adopters by state to the household median in the state, and New York and Pennsylvania were at the far extremes of that table. And you hinted on it a little, but New York and Pennsylvania don't seem as dramatically different demographically as a lot of states. What's causing the difference in those 2 states between the income of adopters there versus the average median income in those states?
Yeah, I'm looking at that now. So just to clarify, Pennsylvania is on one end. The other end is not New York, it's Nevada. So
okay, sorry.
It's a small font size. So NV looks a lot like NY. but New York is not far away from Nevada, so the question is not completely unfounded. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really know. I mean, I think it may in part relate to this point about sort of kind of overall levels of income inequality within a state. I don't know offhand sort of how the sort of broader income distribution in New York and Pennsylvania compare. But Pennsylvania, I would say, is sort of an outlier among all of the states. And it is also, I would say, a state where we don't have very good coverage. And so I think I would be somewhat reluctant to place too much weight on that particular data point.
Also,
Okay,
Pennsylvania was an outlier for the DAC figure as well. And so I actually did look into what was happening. And I think sort of like Galen said, our coverage across some states is almost perfect, and coverage across other states is not as perfect. And in Pennsylvania, what I was seeing was the reason that the majority were located in DACs, or not the majority, but like disproportionately more were located in DACs, was because a lot of the installations were coming from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. So a lot of the adopters in our data set in Pennsylvania are specifically located in very urban areas, specifically Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, where I think you know, the incomes and everything, I guess, that makes a DAC a DAC. So all those other indicators are very different than the rest of the state of Pennsylvania.
okay, good. And in your analysis of owner-occupied adoption by minority homeowners, is it possible to analyze that by income from the data? Can somebody see the extent to which minority homeowners are more or less likely to adopt solar compared to the population of minority homeowners by different income levels?
We use the American Community Survey. They don't have the tables that slice and dice that data in that way that I found. If I'm wrong, I would love for someone to email me and let me know where that table is. So, I mean, we can do that with our data. The issue is just we don't have the table for the comparison population to compare it to. So we can do it by income. We can do it by householders of different race, ethnicities, and then maybe even some different layers. But I couldn't find the specific like intersection of income and race.
Yeah, well, one thing that we do have though in the report, which we didn't present today, is some analysis that does break out the data by both race and ethnicity and also income levels, where we show the relative income of solar adopters for minority households versus non-Hispanic white households. And there we find that the relative income or the income skew for minority adopters is much smaller when compared to other owner-occupied households in the same county. And so, you know, put differently, minority households who adopt solar are much more similar to other owner-occupied households in the same county in terms of income than is the case when looking at non-Hispanic white adopters. Non-Hispanic white adopters tend to be wealthier than other households in the same county. Minority adopters tend to be have more or less the same income as other households in the same county.
That's very interesting. Does your analysis or other work you've done provide any insight into what are the top policy drivers that tend to lift low and moderate income adoption in a particular location?
Well, we did do some work on that a few years ago, a paper that Eric actually led. So maybe I'll throw that one his way.
Sure. And we continue to look at it. So the paper we did a few years ago, we looked at incentives, just income-based incentives. These are subsidies that are restricted to low-income households, and found evidence that, not surprisingly, incentives do work. The catch there is that LMI incentive programs tend to be very small. So we're not talking, it's not really a scalable solution. Another one was PACE programs. These are where you can increase the value of a system based on your home property value, and likewise found that PACE can help LMI. And then arguably the biggest factor of them all was leasing or third-party ownership. So a model that allows homeowners to adopt solar with no or little money down. The evidence suggests that was probably the biggest factor that opened up the market to LMI households. And that is ultimately a policy decision. Not every state allows third-party ownership. And we continue to do work to look at questions of why is there lots of low-income adoption in certain places, not others. So that will be research coming out in the next year or so.
Yeah, and I think with all the money going towards it, like solar for all, obviously the winners of the first, all the applications haven't been announced yet by the EPA, but those are sort of regionally concentrated dollars going towards this specific topic. So conceivably, we'll be able to see an effect of this in the data that we get, and it could be something that we could report on later on.
Good. Well, just so you know, following up on your comments about Pennsylvania and Eric's comments about the previous analysis, somebody wrote in talking about why Philadelphia numbers skew high and low and moderate income installations. It's because there was a program there in the city of Philadelphia 2.5 years ago that involved the company Posigen, and a lot of it had to do with third-party ownership and a municipal partnership that particularly targeted that audience, but especially a lot did have to do with third-party ownership. And somebody was asking, how does PACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy, how does that tend to move solar adoption forward?
It's been a long time, and PACE has not really expanded since then, so it's kind of fallen off of our radar. As I understand it, it's a way that allows you to capture more of the value from solar. And back when we found that it helps low-income adoption specifically, the hypothesis was that every dollar helps, that it makes a greater marginal impact for low-income households than for high-income households. So basically anything that kind of sweetens the pot. Someone made the comment earlier about willingness to pay, willingness to adopt. When it comes to low-income adoption, it's, as Galen mentioned, Kim Walski has found, it's not so much about willingness. Low-income households are as willing and interested in solar as other households. Oftentimes it's about ability. So anything, PACE, incentives, third-party ownership, anything that helps solar become more accessible is ultimately going to be of greater benefit to low-income households than others.
Hey,
I think
that's
PACE has fallen off
good.
because, oh no, I was just gonna say, I think PACE has fallen off because there are like opportunities, I guess, for it to be detrimental to homeowners, and it potentially, like, I think could be more vulnerable, even so if you're low and moderate income. So I think that's partly the reason why it's maybe fallen out. But
well, thank you. And it's good to leave on the point about willingness to pay and willingness to adopt, and the fact that there's going to be more opportunities for low and moderate income households to both pay and adopt solar in the coming years. But I want to thank all of you from Berkeley Lab, Galen and Sydney and Eric. As always, your explanations were very clear and very helpful. So thank you very much. And I hope all of you who attended this webinar will come back and attend future webinars. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Warren. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.